Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest live episode of The Free Marketeers. We're discussing a very non-contentious and easy topic today. We should get through this in about 10 minutes, so I hope that we don't take up too much of your Friday afternoons. Helping me to unpack the whole discussion and debate around vaccine mandates specifically and vaccine passports in the South African context. I'm joined by Daniël Eloff and Martin van Staden. Daniël and Martin, thanks very much for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Chris. Nice to be here.
So just yesterday in the US, President Biden announced that they will have a form of vaccine mandates now. This rule will require that all private employers with upwards of 100 employees mandate weekly testing, as well as plans to require vaccines for most federal workers and contractors. Biden also said he would require employers to provide paid time off to get the vaccine, and he urged large entertainment venues to require proof of vaccination or testing to gain entry. As is often the case, South Africa seems to take its lead from the worst elements in the West and other parts of the world, of course. So I'm guessing that kind of thing is coming to South Africa. In Limpopo last week, we had Tshwane Mayor Randall Williams saying that if he had his way, unvaccinated people won't be able to buy alcohol. He said Gauteng is unlikely to meet its targets due to low turnout at several vaccination centers in the province. And of course, President Ramaphosa has told his cabinet members to look at possible innovations which could assist the resumption of activities in South Africa, and this includes vaccine mandates. So it's the worldwide trend at the moment. It's coming probably to South Africa in some forms. Daniël, I thought we'd start with you, just on the Constitution specifically, the South African Constitution. Can the government implement a vaccine mandate? Is it, not that the language would say explicitly you may or may not, but what is there in the Constitution that can provide support one way or the other?
I'm going to give you the typical lawyer answer is it depends, and it's sort of a yes and no. But unfortunately, that's the case here as well. There's a variety of constitutional rights and constitutional provisions that are at play here. Your right to bodily integrity, freedom, security of your person, your human dignity, I'd argue, is even at threat here. So you can rant off a list of constitutional rights that might be infringed if there's a vaccine mandate. I think we should perhaps sort of go back to the basics of this entire thing and just sort of remind ourselves what this pandemic is. What's it truly? We're sitting with a virus. I've had the virus. Martin, you've had the virus. Chris, I don't know if you've had the virus, but you've dodged it so far. We live with this thing among us, and it has a bit more than a 2% mortality rate, right? So the question that we all really have to ask ourselves is, are we perhaps not sort of overreacting? And I know this sounds strange 18 months down the line into this pandemic, but I think any sane person should be asking this question. Was it worth it, completely collapsing our economy for the past 18 months? Is it worth it compelling people to take a drug that is arguably still, not as tested as it should be? Now, I perhaps should just mention from the outset, my shoulder is still a little bit sore because I went for my first shot last week. So it's in no way am I an anti-vaxxer in this case. In fact, my wife is very pro-vaccinations, and so am I, because I think it's a medical marvel that we've witnessed the last couple of months. But the fact that the vaccine is good, the fact that the vaccine helps against this virus, is not compelling enough reason to say, well, government or any other institution should implement compulsory vaccinations. And the reason I say any other institution is my suspicion is South Africa will follow a similar path of what we're seeing in the States at the moment. It's not a federal, in the United States, it's not a federally mandated vaccination. They're doing it through the employers. And interestingly, in South Africa, we already actually have compulsory vaccinations for COVID. The labor regulations that were promulgated last year in July already require workplaces vaccinate, and there's sort of a list of criteria, but they basically, the guidelines say you may compel your employees to be vaccinated, and then there's sort of a list of exclusions if it's for if they object because of religious reasons, if they can work from home and it's therefore not necessary to work in the workplace. So, but I mean, the point is, we're already in a position where it's compulsory through employers. And again, this week we saw big medical aides telling their employees they're going to compel them to vaccinate by the beginning of this year. And again, I just look at all of this and I ask myself, is this really necessary? Is it necessary to compel a young, healthy person who's already perhaps had COVID to vaccinate if they really don't want to? I mean, I don't care. I've had COVID. I'm healthy, I'm young, but I still got the shot because I sort of weighed up the pros and the cons, and I was just like, I might as well go get it. But there might be other people. I don't think you need this compelling reason to say, well, because of my religion, I don't want to get the vaccine, or because of X, Y, and Z reason. It really is as simple as a person just saying no, and it ought to be fine.
Martin, there's a lot to unpack from what Daniel said now. But one thing, this is maybe more theoretical, but you've also touched on it before, I've noticed, and it's something I've wanted to highlight, is the pandemic has really concretized this idea of binding everyone's healthcare to everyone else's, and that states and governments should be responsible for, quote unquote, taking care of the public health, which is immeasurable, but they're supposed to take care of it. So, I mean, Daniel's point where, yes, my friend or my family member, my neighbor, they can choose to get the vaccine, I choose not to. But then you get the argument, if there aren't enough of us taking the vaccine, we don't reach herd immunity, for example, so it affects all of us. What do you think of that sort of that line and that contention to the idea, to the point of, oh, well, it doesn't, my neighbor can get it and I don't have to?
Yeah. Well, let me say first off, and it's always a bit of a annoyance to have to declare these things, but COVID is a problem. It's not. I agree with Daniel that there's probably been an overreaction, but people would take us saying that and say we are heartless people who want people to just die en masse. COVID is a huge problem. I did not have a mild case of COVID. I had a terrible case of COVID, and I would not wish that upon anyone. I think it's a terrible disease. My family has lost several friends and so on. It's heart-wrenching. It's terrible. It's one of the worst things that has happened in my life so far is COVID, the pandemic, not the lockdowns as well, but the pandemic is very traumatic. So it's terrible. But there are worse things. There are simply worse things, and the state imposing its will, whether it's a good idea with good intentions or bad intentions, in this type of way on a massive society, on a massive scale, is a worse thing than COVID, because of the precedents that it sets for the future, for any multiple other number of other things that society might come across in the future, for the extreme economic damage that it's done, specifically in South Africa. We don't have the economic health to really jump back from this. The people who are now unemployed because of lockdown will remain unemployed forever, probably, if I'm being cynical, as I tend to be. So it's terrible, but there are worse things. Now, what you mentioned there, Chris, is essentially the argument from the harm principle. And increasingly, a lot of liberals, libertarians, people who believe in freedom, who aren't statists, are also applying.
It is a big tent, so that's what you get with a big tent.
Yeah, it's not that big a tent. But anyway, a lot of people are applying the harm principle, for which John Stuart Mill is best known. Now, I think that the harm principle is doing some heavy lifting there that it wasn't meant to be doing, at least when Mill wrote it. Now, I'm not a massive fan of John Stuart Mill, but I think if you were around today, and people were using the harm principle to justify probably the biggest, most coordinated state intervention in something that's very intimate, in personal lives, in your medical affairs, I think you would be horrified. This isn't just a yellow fever certificate whereby if you are part of that very small group of people and you want to travel to a very specific list of countries, you need to be inculcated against yellow fever. It's not that. This is a initiative where if you ask the real movers behind this idea, they want all 7 billion of us around the world to be vaccinated, right down from babies who are just born up to people who are on their deathbeds waiting to die from old age. They want everyone vaccinated. That has never happened in our history. That is insane. It is insane to want such a coordinated, centrally planned initiative to be imposed on everyone. Perhaps accepting the few people who have medical reasons not to be vaccinated, but it is probably the most coordinated deprivation of human liberty in history. I mean, there have been worse deprivations of liberty, but not nearly as coordinated and as widespread as this, I would say. There definitely are worse things, and I don't think the harm principle can be used in this way. The harm principle is meant to be a liberal principle that essentially said that your right to swing your fist stops at my nose. You're not allowed to harm me. Colloquially and on the ground, we intuitively know what this means. But now it's being taken to cover a whole range of things that could never be within its ambit. To say that if you have COVID and you walk around and you infect someone, then somehow you have deprived those people of their rights. You have in liberal theory, you have committed a crime, and if they die, you have committed murder. I mean, that is that cannot be. If you drive around a school district in South Africa, you could hit a child. There's probably a percentage that you can assign to that, the chances of you hitting a child. And does that mean that the government must prohibit driving per se because there's a possibility that you could hit someone driving? Does that mean that everyone who has infected anyone else with the common cold must be arrested for assault because they sneezed near you and you had to spend 2 days in bed? Sometimes when you get attacked and punched, you have to spend 2 days in the hospital. It's the same principle. Why do we exempt those, but when it comes to COVID, we apply this massive principle? And of course, you can say that COVID is more deadly. You can say COVID is more serious. But the fact is that you are not being harmed with intent. If someone decides, listen, this is my body, I am not going to get vaccinated. I have done the weighing up and everything. It's the same as deciding not to get a flu shot. You make that decision as a free individual, and then you happen to infect someone else. Should you be seen as a rights violator? I think no. I think that approach is not harmonizable with a open and democratic society, with a free society. Because if we accept that principle, then freedom itself is gone. It's dead. So I'm very concerned about that argument, Chris, that rights are being violated. If you decide not to get the vaccine, you make that decision a very, very trite liberty that everyone has, which our constitution so clearly entrenches and so clearly recognizes. I mean, it's one of the most libertarian aspects of the constitution. It says nobody can, everyone has a right to freedom and security of it's bodily integrity. It's Article Section 12.2, bodily integrity, including the right to make decisions about the control of their body, something along those lines. Very, very individual rights centric, and I mean it's unequivocal. So yeah, that's a problematic argument. I would encourage liberals, libertarians, people who are inclined to freedom, to tread carefully. Because this is the same way we got to a lot of other state interventions, which started at a kind of a liberal sentiment and developed into unbridled tyranny. So rather be very, very careful with that. Again, COVID is terrible, but there are worse things, and unleashing government like this is one of those worst things.
Perhaps if I may just sort of take what Martin was saying a bit further, I think there's an arbitrariness to people arguing for these vaccine mandates, which I don't quite understand. Because, I mean, again, we all acknowledge COVID is a problem. We all acknowledge that it's this public health issue that we need to deal with in some way. The question is just, to what extent can government compel any person to seek medical treatment? I mean, if we can say, well, it's in your interest not to be overweight, can government come and confiscate your food? I mean, surely not. We will say that's ridiculous. But now the question becomes, where do you draw that arbitrary line? Where does it where's it acceptable for government to intervene in your health decision, and where does it not? I mean, and in my view, it's quite simple. We have quite clear, formulated lines where a medical practitioner can, on your behalf, make a decision because either you're unconscious, you've just been in a traumatic accident, and then there's this decision is made on your behalf. But I mean, if you're completely, awake, completely aware of your surroundings, can government really come in and just on your behalf decide you need to get this medical treatment? And I've struggled to find any person who can explain to me where that arbitrary line is. And then secondly, if you're able to explain to me why where the line is, then I want a person to explain to me, well, why is it drawn there exactly? Why is the one, let's say the one circumstance to the left or to the right of that arbitrary line? Why do you make that? Why do you distinguish exactly at that particular point?
Yeah, and I think then you run into part of it is, again, the state having to take care of all our healthcare. So, for example, if it's the state's job to make sure that hospitals aren't overwhelmed through COVID, then there's a precedent or a reason for them to try and regulate activity so that more people don't get COVID and healthcare resources don't get overwhelmed. It's a very sort of centralist, statist point of view of managing a country's quote unquote resources, whereas a country doesn't, it's simply the people in the country who are managing those things. It's not the country, as it were, as an entity. But
if I can just add to that, Chris,
go ahead.
Just something that's not noticed. A lot of people are saying that to get away from lockdown, we need to do this vax mandate. It's like it's the lesser tyranny that government can impose on us to combat COVID is we can get rid of lockdown if we all just vaccinate. But the problem here is that and it's unfortunate that people don't necessarily notice this, but lockdown is the initial deprivation of freedom by government. It's a self-reinforcing argument. It's circular. To say that for government essentially, and I know that there's a lot of privatization of statism happening here, but when I talk about government, I see it in a very broad sense, even when government is nudging companies to do so. The government is using its own prior conduct to justify further deprivations of liberty. Now that's perverse. That's very, very perverse. And as constitutionalists, as freedom lovers, before we even discuss vaccination or vaccination mandates and passports, we need to insist immediately, right now, that every freedom we have been deprived since March of last year be returned to us unconditionally, because that shouldn't even be up for discussion. Lockdown needs to end immediately, and all that freedom needs to return. And then, only then, can we discuss vax mandates. We cannot allow government to say, we'll give you your freedom back if you do this. That's extortion, that's blackmail. That's an unacceptable argument for them to be making, and truly, I say this with all due respect to certain liberal colleagues of ours, that's a totally unacceptable argument for a liberal to be making, because it's really adding to the authoritarian statist structure that we have to contend with every day. No, we want our freedom back unconditionally, and then yes, let's discuss vaccination mandates then.
Daniel, is there any legal difference between the state compelling citizens to get the vaccine versus their employer in the constitution or in legal precedent or anything like that? Is there anything to indicate anything differently? Is it better if I am unemployed, then there's less chance that the state will compel me instead of my employer, for example?
No, I think it's easier for government to get your employer to do it because, like you mentioned, it's more sensitive. You want to keep your job. But if we look strictly speaking at the Bill of Rights, it's not just the vertical application between the state and the individual. It also applies horizontally between individuals and the individual, and in this case, an employer. So they still have to adhere to the Constitution and to your constitutionally enshrined rights. The question will just become how those rights are interpreted, because you could and as our courts have unfortunately previously done, interpret Section 12 in such a manner, in a perverse manner, like Martin would say, to say, well, it's to protect your bodily integrity, you have to get the vaccination, and I mean it's just a ridiculous. I'd say argument and a framing of that particular right. But I'm just to again, I'm quite enjoying this conversation and to latch on what Martin was saying is, I think the question we need to ask ourselves is what coercion is acceptable, right? Because in you could ask yourself the question, well, is it okay for your church to compel you to get the vaccination? Or could your church say, well, you can't come to church, or you can't come to your club, or you can't come to this venue? But it touches on the what Martin remarked earlier on the privatization of statism to a certain extent, because if the moment the state sees, well, we can just use these, normal societal institutions to achieve our goals in any case, they'll do that. Then they'll just mandate it through another means, and so it's a difficult discussion. Where are those lines drawn? Can a private, institution or business prohibit my entrance if I'm not vaccinated? My gut feel says yes. I mean, by all means, they're able to, because, and I think the flip side of that coin is you're going to get other institutions or other businesses who don't require that, who don't mandate that. And then they're going to get a bunch of people who take their business elsewhere. It might be that they, become some sort of super spreader business at the end of the day. But I mean, the point is that's freedom. That's people's individual and personal choice, and they should be able to make those choices.
Martin, there's an important conceptual and I think practical just consideration here, or tell me if I'm wrong, but the private property argument. So the difference between saying, on my private property, I set the rules, and if you don't, for example, have the vaccine, you can't come into my private property, my business, versus I will infringe on your right to bodily integrity to allow you to come onto my private property.
Yeah, no, as a libertarian, as someone who regards private property as probably the central determining thing in most social issues, the determining institution about which way a certain issue should be decided. This has been one of the most difficult things for me to process, and I wish I had a good insight here. My gut, and I think my gut and Daniel's gut go in the same way here, is that owners of private property should have an unqualified right to make this decision. If you are, I almost said South African Airways, sorry, but if you are an actual private airline, you might be able to say that, you can't fly with us without being vaccinated. If you're a restaurant, you own a restaurant, you can say you cannot come onto the property without showing your vaccination card. Now, that is the very simple Freedom 101 answer to give, and I feel very comfortable with that. But, and this is what has made everything so difficult, and that is that the state has caught on to nudging, this idea that was developed by people, and they call it libertarian paternalism. Now, I object very strongly to the use of the use of the word libertarianism there, but it's from two American authors. I can't remember the one, but the other one is Cass Sunstein, who was a very the most prominent American legal mind, probably. And this is this idea that government needs to stop coercing people, stop requiring whatever, but just nudge people, put an incentive here, persuade businesses there, just nudge people in this direction that the central planners, our gods here on earth, have decided that we need to move in. Now, that is that complicates things. Now, I am not necessarily sure if we should accept a private business telling us we cannot go onto their private property as a result of the state nudging them to that conclusion. Now, the difficulty is, how will you ever know? How will you really know if the state has nudged them into that direction, or whether they came to that conclusion as a private property owner, just exercising their free choice? How can you ever know? Now, my my gut tells me, and I guess this is not necessarily just a gut feeling, but an axiom, I guess, of libertarianism, of liberalism, is that when in doubt, err on the side of freedom. So my gut is going to say, fine, if you've been nudged, if you've been unduly influenced, let's say, as a legal term from South African law, then you can still make that decision and still prohibit people from coming onto your property with a vaccination certificate. But it's still not easy. I think the state has really outdone itself this time in perverting a social order. It's created so much mistrust. You never know if the person excluding you is bona fide making their own decision or whether they're acting as an arm of the state. It's terribly difficult, and I wish I had a clear-cut answer here other than, well, I am filled with doubt, I am filled with uncertainty, and as a result of that, we should just respect the wishes of the owner, even if it turns out that those wishes are in fact the wishes of our family head, our daddy, Cyril Ramaphosa.
I'm going to kick you off the show now, Martin, because I only get people on who actually give me clear-cut and easy answers. I don't want people to actually make me grapple with and think about these issues. So I'm going to kick you off the stream now. Daniel, on the point of vaccine passports, I mean, we all, you need a passport to travel around the world. So the practical, I guess, the sort of easy argument in favor of them is you already need a piece of paper to travel around the world. So why not just link your vaccine to that? I mean, part of my worry very much about it, more practical than just moral, is how it's going to discriminate against citizens from countries whose vaccine rollouts haven't been good and where there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy. So especially in Africa, and Africans have throughout history suffered the brunt of discrimination, especially regarding travel. And now there's simply another reason added onto that list. So sorry, I know I've jumped now from the practical point about, you just have a passport anyway, to the discrimination point. But I just wanted to give you a bit of space to talk about vaccine passports specifically.
Yeah, and it's an important question because it's undoubtedly coming. And again, I think we need to go back to the basics and ask ourselves why. Because it's not a foreign concept. Martin referred to yellow fever shots earlier. I mean, it's already there are already some forms of or let's say criteria that in some countries they require you to comply with before you're able to enter. And I think there's a reasonable case to be made to say, well, for COVID it might be, but surely it can't just be broad sweeping for the entire world forever and ever. Can't ever take it back. Surely it has to be linked in some way to the prevalence of COVID in that country in the preceding couple of months. Is it even a problem or not? And you have to give some due consideration to factors like you mentioned of countries where people haven't been broadly vaccinated. Again, if we look at a country like New Zealand, where arguably people will in any case be vaccinated, but they have relatively low COVID rates because they've locked down quite seriously. So why is it necessary to compel a New Zealander to be vaccinated before they visit the UK or Australia or the USA? So I again, and this is an administrative law principle. Now we're talking domestic law, not international, but any decision, you can't just make any decision and then say, well, because the decision is a decision, it stands. There has to be some sort of rational connection between the decision and what you're trying to achieve. And in South African law, even more importantly, in a constitutional framework, you have to look at less restrictive means. You have to make sure, well, was the decision, could you have achieved what you wanted to achieve in other ways, in ways that don't infringe as grossly as they do here? And I think the same principles apply to this question of vaccine passports. It can't. We have to be nuanced. We have to ask more pertinent questions, and it can't just be, oh well, COVID's here, everyone get vaccinated, and remember to get your booster shots until you're 90 years old.
Don't worry, I'm sure for anyone on Discovery, they will get more vitality points the more booster shots they get. So that problem is solved.
Yeah, now we don't
have one comment here.
We don't have to exercise anymore. We can just get the shot.
We have one comment here, Daniel, which means you and I need to jump off now. So you and I are communist shills. So you and I are done for the day. I think this is important to highlight as well, this conversation around vaccine passports and mandates. Just here with the World Economic Forum again and the new normal. Klaus Schwab, for example, this has been, I think, discussed at various points, but we should keep on focusing on this point. I mean, how seriously one takes it or not, as Martin has pointed out, there's definitely a very coordinated sort of linked effort between governments. And for a lot of people involved in those governments, they might have the noblest of intentions. But as C.S. Lewis pointed out, there might be no worse tyranny than that tyranny which is done for your own benefit, for the people's quote unquote good. Martin, just a little bit on the Great Reset and the sort of build back better idea. I mean, and you can even link this to things like sugar taxes, alcohol taxes, that kind of thing. Maybe all of these things, we've already got the sugar tax in South Africa, but how governments and central planners and social tinkerers want to make us healthier through these plans and schemes that they have.
Yeah, look, there's a saying, and I don't recall who said it, but no government will let any crisis go to waste, and that basically means that any tragedy, I mean, a mass shooting, pandemic like this, government will pounce on that and use it to curb people's freedoms. I mean, that is, we've just seen this repeatedly. Something terrible happens, a mass shooting in the United States. Everyone is sad about it, and rightly so. Everyone is outraged about it. And then the next day, you have restrictions on weapon ownership. Jacinda Ardern from New Zealand, which Daniel mentioned earlier, she is the hero on the left for this. There was a mass shooting in Christchurch a few years ago. The next day, they banned, I believe, semi-automatic rifles. She just banned it. It's done. It's over. No more semi-automatic rifles in New Zealand. Now we see this here with COVID in epic proportions. The Great Reset, really, and you guys being communist should like this. I mean, it's really it's a communist from the World Economic Forum, and apparently historically a neoliberal, so-called neoliberal Washington consensus pro-free market institution is essentially calling for this Great Reset, and a big part of that is this idea that the institution of private property should be whittled away. I think Schwab was the guy who said in the future that you will own nothing and you will be happy. And that should be seen in light of many other things that are being done. Build Back Better, the new normal in South Africa, where our ministers have now repeatedly said that we're going to use COVID and we're going to use the lockdown to speed up Black economic empowerment and transformationism into the private sector. It's an incredible perversion of the role that the state is supposed to play in our lives. It is incredible. And the worst part of it is really that the West has become really the leader in it. You don't hear about the Nigerian government or the government of Togo really leading the charge in how to innovatively take away their citizens' freedoms. We're seeing it from Australia, we're seeing it from New Zealand, we're seeing it from the UK, and there's a lot of confusion in the United States. But the free West is leading the charge against freedom, and the neoliberal institutions, the WEF, is leading the charge against freedom, and that is an incredibly big problem for us as broadly liberals and free marketeers and so on. It's hugely problematic, and as you say, this is something we cannot lose sight of. We cannot talk about vaccine passports and lockdown and COVID in isolation. As people in the policy field, as people in the legal field, we have I think, a unique responsibility to inform everyone who is concerned about these things that, listen, there is a larger thing happening here. It's not reptiles dressed in human clothing. It's not the Jews. It's not the Rothschilds. It's not that. It's a in fact, a decentralized statist sentiment all around the world that has now really come about and crystallized into this technocratic control of society, which we need to be very wary of. And the most pertinent manifestation of that is this constant appeal to what the experts are saying. No, screw the experts. We are free individuals. They have their expert opinions, and we can weigh them up and we can decide for ourselves. We are not denying their expertise, but they are not experts in our lives. That is our decision. That is what makes a free society, and we need to inform people of the reality of this. You are a free individual, and it's up to you.
Daniel, what recourse would people have? For example, if your employer or the state forces you to take the vaccine and you get not terminally ill, because then if you sue them, there's no point because you'll be dead. So what are the points of suing someone if you can't get the benefits from that? But if you suffer grievous bodily harm, something like that, what recourse do people have? Is there a sort of silver bullet that people can pursue? Should they simply try and speak to certain legal firms, organizations? What do you think in that regard?
Perhaps to answer your question with 2 points. The first is there are many organizations who will fight this. One organization that I'm involved with, and we actually consulted this week regarding this particular question in Solidarity, and they're going to take a big case to right through our courts, from the High Court to the Supreme Court of Appeals to the Constitutional Court, to challenge exactly this. And what's interesting about Solidarity's approach is they released about, I think, 2 months ago, an entire report where they basically argue in favor of vaccines. They say they think vaccines are safe, and people, if they want to, should get the vaccine. But simultaneously, they're very much opposed to compulsory vaccinations, which I think is sort of the gist of this entire conversation as well. So there are organizations looking into this. Our firm's been flooded with people inquiring about this, saying their employers are compelling them to get vaccinated by a certain date. If I can perhaps answer how I think it will play out, we're not going to have one particular case that's going to sort of settle the debate forever. It's not going to be a matter of, the Constitutional Court said compulsory vaccinations are fine or they're not fine, and then that's the end of the discussion. What will likely happen is we're going to have a litany of cases where the court determines, is it fine in these particular circumstances? Can it be compelled in these circumstances, or at this place, or at this time, or whatever? So we're going to basically have, I think, in the next couple of years, the courts are going to settle: is it okay for a young person working at X, Y, and Z place, or for an older person at whatever place, in these and whatever circumstances? That's how it will play out. We don't have a system of law where you have this one massive case and then it's sorted out forever and ever. And I don't think this question is one of those questions. It's not a binary question and then the debate is settled. So that's how I sort of believe it will play out in the next couple of years. But yes, if people want to reach out, firstly, if you have a labor union, contact your labor unions, because it's not just Solidarity that's quite opposed to this. Interestingly, if we talk about the politics of the ANC and its alliance partners, I think that's sort of a predicament they're going to face in the next couple of years. But approach your labor unions, approach your local attorneys. You can approach us, approach the organizations you already support who fight for your freedom and liberty, because your particular fact sheet might just be the fact sheet that they need to go to court, because that's what we're doing with Solidarity now. Is we're looking for just the right fact sheet so that we can go to court with it, because the other issue is we just being overwhelmed with people contacting us, and you have to sort of filter through all of them to get one that will likely succeed in the end of the day.
Martin, probably the most important question: if Section 25 of the Constitution is amended and private property no longer exists, surely the state can just do whatever it likes across the country.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what the reality will be if we lose sight of that very important debate, which is what COVID has done. quite interestingly enough. A lot of things were very interesting to a lot of people and very important to a lot of people in March of last year. And then at the end of March of last year, none of those things mattered anymore. And unfortunately, the amendment to Section 25 of the Constitution is one of those things. It is still, in my view, a bigger threat to the prosperity of South Africans than lockdown and even vax mandates. To me, it's the issue of our time. And if the government succeeds in adopting the revised or the second revision of that bill into the Constitution, and the government proceeds and declares vast swathes of property to be under state custodianship, then that's exactly what's going to be the case. It's not going to be a matter of it's on a restaurant's private property. If restaurants or commercial or retail is under the custodianship of the state, which it will be empowered to do, then the state can simply say, it's part of our mission to promote the public good on property over which we have sway. And in fact, it would be unconstitutional for us not to require this safety measure. So if we don't have a broader picture, a lot of these things are going to be snuck in the back door. And I would really encourage everyone to keep a very, very close eye on the Section 25 thing. The media is making it seem like this isn't going anywhere, and the ANC and the EFF are not going to vote together. That may be true, and that would be great, but keep an eye on it. I don't think we should celebrate before that issue has really been resolved.
Daniel, I might be putting you on the spot a bit now, but I wanted to ask a bit about South African case law, and if there's anything that immediately jumps into your head, like a highlight of where the public good, public health, the public interest was used as a case for more state intervention, the state to dictate X or Y. I mean, we have for example, just off the top of my head, we have in general the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Obviously, it's very broad and has all sorts of other stuff. But is there anything in South African history? I mean, we probably too often think of, in America in 19 whatever, this thing happened in 1880 in the UK. I'm just wondering if there's any sort of case where this has happened in South Africa. I don't know that we've had these huge pandemics before, so.
Not in the sort of public health sense. The public good and the broader public well-being has been used by our courts frequently. It's like my favorite communist writer is obviously Hayek, and he said that emergencies have always been used as, I think the quote says, it's always been used to protect. Emergencies have always been the pretext on which the safeguards of liberty have been washed away, or something along those lines. My favorite communist writer, by the way, for us communist shills. So the point is, these type of emergencies have been used frequently in our courts, and it's not even it hasn't just been used for like pressing emergencies. They talk about the housing emergency, or the emergency that people are facing with the death penalty or whatever. In some instances, it's good. In some instances, it's really something dire, like I would argue for with the death penalty, where I think the courts rightly said this is a problem, and they stepped in. But in other cases, it's sort of this empty promise. So what would happen is the court would say, this is an issue. And then they say, okay, but how do we resolve this issue? And they say, okay, we need to say, well, it's a right. And then suddenly they declare this thing a right. And then they say, okay, cool, now that it's a right, can I get my house, or can I get my dialysis treatment? And then the court says, oh no, but sorry, we don't have resources, but it will be, and this is the magic word that the court always uses, progressively realized. And then everyone's happy, because then everyone says, okay, excellent. The Constitutional Court agrees with us. We have a right to dialysis treatment. We have a right to a home. But in the end of the day, the people still don't have a home, and they don't get proper medical treatment, because we're just so fixated on ideology and not on actual tangible results that betters the lives of people, that actually ensures people have homes, that actually ensures people have access to healthcare. But we just look sort of, and this, it's a cliche, but it is a sort of a virtue signaling of sorts, to just say, okay, but we've declared it a right, problem addressed. We don't really care if people actually get what we argue for. We just want to say we did something.
Yeah, if I may just add onto that about our courts, the bigger issue for me is that the courts, when faced with something that is And this is not an absolute rule. There have been exceptions, and the big one is homosexual relations in South Africa and death penalties, where the courts have really bravely and very admirably, in my view, taken the very pro-liberty stance and done so on a principled level. But in other cases where it's not so clear cut, and I think COVID, some of the cases we've seen in the courts during the early part of the lockdown. COVID is not one of those cases. COVID is a complicated issue. It's a sensitive issue, and the courts are very, very unsure about how to approach this. And I think that'll probably apply to health issues more broadly because it's so specialized and because the judges as individuals, and this is a very legal realist approach, that they are simply not sure what to make of it, and they're afraid that if they set a precedent, a strong precedent, they might kill everyone. So the courts are very concerned about stuff like that, and we saw this with the lockdown. One of the first cases was the BR case, Liberty Fighters Network, where Judge Norman Davis of Pretoria came out very strongly, very, very strongly against lockdown in general, and then really made sweeping, and in my view, it's very good. It's a very libertarian case. Most lawyers would disagree with me and say it's nonsense. But I think it was a very principled take about how the government has really not applied the Constitution in the way that they should have. They have not considered Section 36, which is the principles that they need to apply to limit the constitutional rights of South Africa. The judge said, it's clear that in basically none of your regulations you applied the standard. Therefore, all of your regulations, with a few exceptions, are unconstitutional. And that was excellent. That was great. I thought, wow, this guy is my favorite judge. But quite predictably, that was reversed a few months ago by the Supreme Court of Appeal. And most other cases, the Asal case, where our former colleague Mpiaki Dlamini was involved, and there's another, the TISA case, the independent tobacco guys. In both those cases, the courts really did this very, I don't want to say nuanced because that implies it's a good thing, but this very uncommitted approach whereby they essentially said, listen, this is an executive thing. There's an emergency in the country. The minister has consulted with her experts, and her experts have said she's made a good decision, and essentially the court isn't going to get involved there, applying a very low standard of constitutional review for that reason. The court doesn't want to. They don't want the headline to say court judgment leads to the end of the world. That's not something the courts want. So that's what I'm concerned about, is that our courts aren't nearly activist enough. Judicial activism can be a big problem, but in this case, it is. I think we're seeing too little of it. The courts are not standing up as the guardians of our constitutional rights nearly as much as they should. It's actually quite surprising that the Constitutional Court has not heard a single lockdown case, to my knowledge. Daniel can correct me on that if I'm wrong, but I don't think they've heard a single lockdown case. That's amazing. It's insane, actually, that we've had this massive deprivation of constitutional rights in this country, and the highest court has not heard a single case about it. So yeah, that's how the courts have really dealt with the issue so far. It's a very cautious and overly cautious approach, and I think we're probably going to keep seeing that at least until COVID whittles out. And I think I'm kind of hopeful. I'm not a medical expert. I may be totally wrong, but what I'm seeing kind of is that we're approaching the peak of COVID, and that it's going to start whittling away, and things are slowly but surely going to go back to normal. Then the courts might be able to feel more comfortable taking a harder line. But at this stage, I don't see our solution necessarily as being one fell swoop in the courts. I see it as civil society, as citizens more broadly, just drawing a line in the sand and saying, listen, no, we're not going to do this. So cry me a river. We're going to carry on as normal.
This one is for both of you, but Daniel should probably go first because Martin just finished speaking. But tomorrow marks 20 years since the 9/11 attacks in 2001 on the Twin Towers. Over the past 2-3 weeks, the final planes have taken off from Kabul airport in Afghanistan, taking American troops out of the country. What remains is the Patriot Act. What remains is tapping of American citizens and citizens all around the world. What remains is everything that Edward Snowden warned about and pointed out, Julian Assange as well, maybe to a lesser extent, but he also exposed a lot of stuff. So I think that's an apt and good reminder, and people shouldn't take it for granted that we're just going to have liberty forever, that these emergency pretexts are used to expand government powers massively, and governments don't let these go.
Yeah, well, I mean, just give me one example of where emergency powers have been granted to a government and they've just willingly let it go. You can't. It never happens because the justifications just keep on coming in, and the problem is the threat never stops. It's like Camus wrote as well that an emergency like this has always been the excuse for tyrants. And exactly the same is happening here. The after COVID, there'll be the consequences of COVID. We're already seeing this sort of groundwork being done, right? Cyril Ramaphosa remarked earlier this year where he said, the Build Back Better thing that you mentioned, Martin, it's this perpetual threat. It's this perpetual thing that we need to address. And that's why we need to be aware of granting these powers to government, because we're not going to be able to get them back. It's that thing. It's another quote, which is, and I'm paraphrasing now, but you can vote in communists, but you have to shoot your way out. And it's exactly the same thing with this. You can legally and legitimately give government powers to try to solve this public health pandemic, but you're not going to be able to democratically and legally take it away from government in the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, the quote that immediately sprung to my mind here is Milton Friedman, who said, "Nothing is so permanent as a temporary government program." And I mean, you just see it everywhere. All the measures that were taken to combat the Great Depression in the 1930s, we still have it today. It's all here. The passport, at least to the extent that it's used today, was instituted during the First World War as a temporary measure to deal with movements across borders during that crisis, that world-spanning tens of millions killing crisis. We still have passports today. And the Patriot Act, as you rightly said, amongst a host of other pieces of legislation in the United States, in Britain, and wouldn't you believe it, in South Africa as well, during the same time we adopted security legislation and surveillance legislation as part of our meager contribution to the war on terrorism. Just because the war in Afghanistan and in Iraq is now supposedly over does not mean this is going away. These are permanent measures that are now part and parcel of our law. And we are going to see the same thing with COVID. I mean, that's just this has been the most epic explosion in government power within a short space of time in history, as far as I can see. And I don't see government taking giving any of that back. And a big reason for that is because there was virtually no resistance to this. With a few exceptions, there were resistance, but it's not like society with one voice. Yeah, no, I mean the work Daniel has done with the organizations he's involved with stands out, and the FMF has resisted, and Sweden for a while they resisted, and there's now protests all around the world resisting it, but we did not, with sufficient unanimity as a civil society, say, listen, no. We get it. You want to do a good thing. That's great. We're with you in spirit. That's great. But no, you're not going to take our freedom. We're just not going to stand for it. We acknowledge this is a problem. We're going to deal with it. We're going to wash our hands voluntarily. We're going to social distance voluntarily. But you're not going to close our businesses. You're not going to prohibit us from buying pies or chicken and buy sandals and stuff. You're not going to do it. We didn't say that. We most people acquiesced to what government decided it was going to do. And that's been the case every single time. It's only when there is a massive pushback from the people as a whole. And I'm no populist. I'm not gonna start saying that we need to do things through majority action now. I don't think you need a majority. I think you need a sufficiently large group of very vocal and dedicated people to make a massive ruckus. We haven't had that. We still don't have that. And if we want our freedom back, that's really going to be the only way to do it. And really, we shouldn't stop with COVID. Right? Let's get rid of the security legislation. Let's get rid of the passport. Let's get rid of the Great Depression agencies that came about. I mean, let's take back our freedom and stop allowing permanent programs out of temporary government action.
Yeah, on that point of voluntarily changing one's behavior, this is pointed out by Ryan Bourne in his book Economics in One Virus, which is a play on Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. But he points to a lot of data from the US specifically, which showed that people started changing their behavior long before states started imposing lockdowns and that kind of thing. So they started changing their behavior before the government tried to use force in that regard. I've saved one of the easiest questions for last, and I hate to give utilitarianism any airtime, but we have to go there because it informs a lot of policy making and thinking in general. Just the argument that for a lot of people, it impacts their freedoms to live normally, quote unquote, when other people refuse to take the vaccines. So someone might be carrying COVID, not that the vaccine will eliminate COVID, but there's a lower chance that you'll get infected, that you'll spread the virus if you have it. So if some people refuse to take it, it impacts on the freedoms of others who want to live normal lives. How do we balance that, as it were? I should ask the person who's most associated with the law and the scales of justice in Daniel.
Well, I mean, it's thank you for leaving the easy questions to the end of the chat. Again, I think what's great about, well, at least the position I take with vaccines is the moment everyone has the ability to get the vaccine and it's your choice whether or not to get it, then it's limited because, I mean, the point is the vaccine protects you. So if you've had it, I don't really care whether or not my neighbor got it or not, because I'm protected. And again, perhaps we should just mention this. The vaccine doesn't protect you from never getting or spreading the virus, right? It just lowers the mortality rates. And we see this in our hospitals. And I know some people believe, well, you know, COVID wasn't a problem. Our hospitals weren't overwhelmed. I can promise you, I had video calls with my poor wife who was working in COVID wards during last year. And I saw firsthand, well, through her videos, what was going on in our public hospitals. And it was bad. And what the vaccine does is it protects against that. It protects against a public health system which shouldn't be there in the first place, but which millions of people rely on, which is really, really vulnerable. So I believe the moment everyone has the ability and they're able to get the vaccine and they decide not to, the argument sort of stops there, because then it's all down to whether or not you decided to get it. Really, it's as simple as that.
Martin, you can touch on that if you want, but also then the other easy question that I wanted to say for you is, but what about the children? So let's say that, you know, giving your children vaccines when they're young obviously, you know, prevents them from getting seriously bad illnesses as they grow up. We've eliminated a lot of diseases over the last 100 years because of better vaccines and people taking them largely. So if parents don't sort of, you know, force their kids to take COVID vaccines, shouldn't the government take on that parental role?
Not at all. And I'm going to answer that question with a bit of a more general answer, I guess. That's not going to be in reference to the children specifically. But if the COVID-19 response hadn't been so politicized, like it has been from the start, there wouldn't have been this level of vaccine hesitancy. When I had to travel to Africa, when they told me you need a yellow fever in Caucasian, I wasn't like, oh no, I'm a sovereign citizen. How dare you? Never. That's never gonna happen. I don't trust the pharmaceutical companies. I didn't go there because it wasn't politicized. There wasn't a concerted campaign in my face to say that you're maliciously trying to kill people around you if you don't do what we tell you to do. And my freedom in general didn't hinge on it. My daily basic freedom to move around, see my family, it didn't hinge on that. So I think that in history, we've eliminated many of these diseases, these viruses, through voluntary vaccinations, through herd immunity that really came about because people they were told there's a problem, they were convinced there's a problem, and they took the necessary action to stop that problem. That is not the case now. The government, and call it the global statist conspiracy if you want, decided they were going to try something new. And that something new was a massive campaign of fear that was totally disproportionate to the actual harm of COVID. Again, COVID is terrible. It's not a small thing. But what we've been hearing in the beginning of the pandemic, they dug 1 million graves in Gauteng. They said 400,000 South Africans were going to die within the first wave. That is absolute fear mongering. And when that didn't prove true, and I mean, this happens in medical science. They're sometimes wrong. But when that proved not to be true, and the government put so much emphasis on it being true and us having to take certain actions to somehow stop that, people lost trust. I lost trust. There's no way in hell that I am now going to play along with whatever the government is doing, because I am always going to assume, and a lot of people are always going to assume, that there are strings attached here, that there are that you're telling me, yes, let me just do this now, but then tomorrow I need to do something else because I've accepted the premise. The politicization of the pandemic and of the response to it has led to the vaccine hesitancy, and it's not that great actually. 73% of South Africans are keen to get vaccinated, so the vast majority of South Africans are keen to get vaccinated. But I think a big proportion of those who are vaccine hesitant, and I'm not one of those. I think I'm going to get the vaccine probably within the next while. I think most of the vaccine hesitant people would not have been had this been approached with prudence, with calmness, with a healthy respect for institutions and for freedom. I think we wouldn't have had to even consider vaccine mandates. I think a far larger portion of people would have been getting it, and when it became necessary, which I don't think it is, then also for children as well. I think the government has screwed this one up royally with its tactics, and therefore now we're stuck in this situation, as with so many other things which governments screw up royally.
I can't really set you up on a better note on which to end, so maybe we should end on that point. I think we've covered a lot of ground, both conceptual and theoretical and the practical. So for that, I have to thank both of you very much for your time on this Friday evening. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks, Chris. It's always lovely joining you on the channel.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Chris.
And it wasn't bad having Martin here as well.
Yeah, your presence added a little bit there, Daniel. Thank you.
I'm glad, Daniel, as communists, we've managed to have a civil discussion with a libertarian such as Martin, who just wants anarchy in the streets and that kind of thing. So it just goes to show what people can achieve. To the viewers, thank you for your time this evening and for joining us. If you're watching this before you leave, please remember to leave a like on the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't yet done so. If you're watching this afterwards, please, that applies to you as well. For more liberal analysis, policy commentary, please go and follow both Martin and Daniel on Twitter. I will link to their profiles in the description below. And please continue supporting the Free Market Foundation in any way that you can, which includes just watching our videos. We greatly appreciate any support that you can give us. Until next time, have a good weekend, and we'll talk to you all again very soon. Bye-bye.